if you're going to go tell your parents for the first time you're going to the big family dinner and you're going to bring up for the first time that like, hey, I really need people to not hug me today. And you know it's going to bring on a whole conversation. Practice what you want to say. And when it comes to setting boundaries, keep it really simple. I'm having a rough day and the hugs don't feel good, though I know they're well-intentioned.
We all know that feeling when we're a bit uncomfortable around someone who is pushing us outside of our comfort zone. How can we understand where our boundaries are? And how can we effectively communicate those boundaries to others? Today's guest, Casey Jourdan, has a master's in mental health and works with neurodivergent people to develop coping skills, including setting boundaries to live more fulfilling lives. That's straight ahead on episode 178. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity Podcast.
A big thank you to all of the mental health professionals who attended our training earlier this week on supporting neurodivergent people who are experiencing suicidality and self-injury. It's always so encouraging to work with professionals who are dedicated to providing a neurodiversity affirming framework to their clients or students and patients. If you are in a mental health agency or a school or even a workplace, and you are looking to create a more affirming environment for the people who you serve or those who work for you, be sure to reach out. I would love to connect with you and find out how we can help you achieve those goals. You can go to our website, neurodiversitypodcast.com, and click on the contact page to get in touch. All right, my conversation with Casey Jourdan is up next.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
That kind of liberal education model where you get to learn a little bit about everything and where you get to have freedom to choose the things that are of interest to you, neurodiverse people, that's where they would thrive. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly how our education system used to be, right? Like the highest thing was that you were a Renaissance man, let's say, someone who does dabble in everything a little bit, but we've moved so far away from that now. We feel like narrowing everything down is doing a service. It's sort of helping people prepare. The truth is that even after college, in order for neurodiverse people to feel successful and functional, they can't be in environments where it's too narrow because that just doesn't match their thinking.
That's episode 170. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Casey Jourdan is my guest today. Casey has a master's in mental health and is passionate about helping neurodivergent people find ways to live their authentic lives outside of what society's typical expectations may be. And she does this through her coaching business. So, Casey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily.
So, Casey, I'm really excited to talk about our topic today, which is setting healthy boundaries, because it's one of those really basic things that we talk about a lot as something we should or need to do, but rarely do we really focus on the how to do it. Mm-hmm. And so for neurodivergent people especially, I often really feel like we need to understand the how. We forget that piece. I'm curious about what brought this particular topic to your attention.
For me, I realize I come from a family that I would say, quote unquote, is naturally good at boundaries. But I want to preface that saying I think boundaries are a skill to be learned. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in a house with a mom who had very strict boundaries about how the world interacted with her. And through that guidance, and then I get out in the world and people don't have boundaries. And I had to kind of figure out my own boundary style. And I just realized that, like I said, this is a skill, but how do I learn a skill if we're not talking about it? And people tend to talk about boundaries just as an inherent thing you should know how to do. And then add on top of it any trauma, any neurodiversity, and it gets real complicated to navigate really fast. And it can be so life-changing to have good boundaries that it just kind of became a thing I became obsessed with.
Can you think of some specific times in your own life where you've struggled to either set boundaries or have boundaries with other people?
Yeah, one of the biggest most challenging areas, my husband and I went through a lot of infertility treatments and a lot of IVF. And we were quite open about what we were going through because we wanted the support and wanted people to know what was going on. But at the same time, everybody wanted every detail. And I was in the midst of going through physical and emotional hell. And we had multiple miscarriages. And like, I hated having to give bad news. And so I had to kind of set some boundaries of, yes, I will tell you everything, but I get to tell you when I'm in the right place for it. I need you to not ask me any questions. And so we had to kind of figure out how to navigate both being very open about the whole situation and honest about the whole situation, but also protecting my mental health along the way.
Right. Yeah, I feel like they don't always know where those lines are. And sometimes it's well-meaning, but not recognizing that that's one example of a way that people kind of push those boundaries. When I think about boundaries within my relationships, there are a lot of different factors. So as you mentioned, there are boundaries about self-disclosure, like when and where do I feel comfortable sharing? Or also, I think something I'm guilty of is oversharing. Where is that boundary there?
Yes.
And then I think there are boundaries about, for example, like emotional labor, like what am I doing for people? Are there other areas that I'm missing, or are those kind of the primary areas?
Yeah, so there's kind of 5 areas that I like to look at. And so there's physical, mental, and emotional, which are similar but also quite different. That emotional labor versus like letting someone take space in your brain. And then there's kind of boundaries around your time and your space. And then communication boundaries about how you're willing to be spoken to or spoke about.
Okay, cool. Can you go into a little bit of those more in depth?
So the physical one is kind of pretty straight. It's the most straightforward of all of them. It's people in your personal space. When I think of especially like family relationships, this can also be mom who's all touched out for the day and just needs to set that boundary of like, hey, kiddo, I need 10 minutes of no touching. How we interact with the world around us at work, it's not appropriate to touch somebody. That's a boundary thing. They get to determine that. So that one's pretty straightforward. Like I said, the mental and emotional kind of overlap with each other a little bit. Emotional being more that not taking on other people's emotions, not carrying that burden for them. With the work I do, and especially like showing up in content, I do a lot of TikTok, is I have some boundaries around trauma dumping in my comment section, both for my personal well-being and also for kind of setting a boundary to protect my audience. And so that being kind of an emotional boundary, a mental boundary being more so like we're allowed to have a difference of an opinion and I'm not going to argue that. And so this is how much mental capacity are you going to put into arguing different beliefs, arguing different opinions, and how much are you going to let that person stay up in your head versus like, nope, I'm not having this conversation, which kind of feeds into communication boundaries of, like I said, how we let people speak to us and how we speak to ourselves. And so setting boundaries of like, I won't allow you to use that tone with me. I don't want you raising your voice at me. This can also be things like not using that language with me. So please don't comment on my body size. Please don't comment on my body shape. Things like that. Communication is how you expect people to speak with you. And the last one being time, which is that how much time, literal hours in the day do you have to give to somebody, and where are your boundaries in protecting your time, which often then feeds into the emotional one. So those ones really tend to tie together because if we're out of time, it tends to take a big emotional toll.
Are there certain areas that you feel like people struggle with the most often?
The mental emotional ones are the biggest. We get charged up about something we're passionate about, and I'm 100% guilty of this. I get charged up. I want to prove my point. I want to be right. I want somebody to see what we're about. Like, let me just say my bachelor's is in political science. I can get fired up about some things. And I sometimes even put myself right over that line where I'm now past my capacity to keep processing this conversation. And so like, I have to be really good with myself of like, I don't have the capacity to keep going on this today. Those are probably the hardest ones. Also, a lot of times because those end up tying into relationships, whether that's work relationships, family relationships. they tend to put the most strain on that emotional and communication stuff. And it gets real complicated real fast when you add in that family component.
You mentioned family and you mentioned that emotional charge that kind of go together in some of those situations. And what it actually made me reflect on is how often kids, whether they're in the educational setting or at home, will sometimes attempt to set a boundary, maybe walking away from a conversation or trying to leave something. And in a family setting or in an educational setting, like how can adults respect those boundaries, sometimes especially for neurodivergent kids who maybe are not great at communicating verbally about where that boundary might need to be?
I'm so glad you brought this one up because it is such an important one that we talk about in adult conversation that like I can say to my spouse, I'm too angry to have this conversation right now and walk away. And yet we don't often let our children do that because it's considered disrespectful. And so it comes to being very aware of that. And sometimes the communication has to happen after the fact. So let them walk away, resist every urge to snatch them up for being disrespectful, give everybody 30 minutes and come back around to it later in the day and say, hey, when you walked away, can you tell me what you were feeling? Can you like come back and explore this? Because if they don't have the language originally, like we have to learn emotions. Like we feel emotions naturally, but we have to learn the words. And so same with boundary setting. They may not know, I felt like I was going to crawl out of my skin. I felt like I was going to explode. So I just walked away. Great. Thank you for not exploding on me. How can we communicate this better next time? Things like that. And also, I think on the flip side of that conversation is giving kids permission to walk away or giving kids permission to set boundaries, because so often they're expected to do as we say, but they need to know that they're allowed to walk away. They need to know that they're allowed to say, please don't touch me anymore today. I don't like hugs. Can we high five instead? And we have to give them all that language.
We have to model what those healthy boundaries look like within our family systems so that they know how to do that when they're older.
Yeah.
I think another piece of this comes from this place of people pleasing, where a lot of folks end up compensating and masking specifically in order to smooth the path ahead of them. And they do end up becoming these people pleasers, which often means that those boundaries get really, really blurred. Do you have any ideas about how people can recognize that, if that's happening with them, or how they can manage it?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we periodically go back and just reassess interactions we're having. If you come home from seeing your best friend and every time you're just wiped and just like almost on the verge of feeling down, like reassess that. What's going on there? You might realize that you're missing a boundary and that every time you see them, they're just trauma dumping on you. And that emotional labor is getting too heavy for you. Same with school. And, and there's some of these situations, it's hard to make a lot of change. School is school, teachers are teachers, to be able to go in and really change the rules. But I think we need to be able to come back and review regularly our relationships, how we're feeling during the day. If you realize you're on the third day in a row of feeling bad, look at these past 3 days. What have been the demands at work? What have been the demands in your relationships? Is there something that is off kilter? And being able to label that is the first step to being able to address it.
I know another area for neurodivergent people is that there's a lot of emotion that is associated with finding out a diagnosis and being neurodivergent, and whether that's related to adults maybe sharing about a diagnosis at work, or families sharing a diagnosis with a school, or people just feeling comfortable sharing with family and friends. That can be a real process to figure out where that boundary is. What are some considerations that people should take into account as they try to figure out where their comfort level is with those various situations?
I think first of all is the disclaimer that it can be a process. This is not just because you have the word now, just because you have a formal diagnosis does not mean you have to run out and tell everybody. I just had this conversation with a client who finally got a formal diagnosis, and she's like, so do I tell my clients now? I said, is it relevant to your clients needing to know? And she's, most of them know. I said, cool. You don't have to tell them anything. And like, there's just this urge of like, do I need to wear it as a badge and tell everybody? Like, first of all, that's completely a personal choice. And then test the waters. Start with the people that you know are safest and see how they respond and play with different language. When I also have post-traumatic stress. I was wounded in Iraq. And when I first was formally diagnosed with PTSD, there was this trial and error of like, nobody understood what a panic attack was. And so like, I couldn't say, hey, I'm having a panic attack. I just had to say like, hey, I'm overwhelmed. Hey, that startled me. I had to test language and test how to explain things before I could kind of decide what language felt best to me.
What I hear you saying is it doesn't always have to be the label or the diagnosis, but more about the impact.
Yeah.
And so I don't necessarily need to label myself as autistic or ADHD or, whatever, but I can give that self-disclosure just more as a way to kind of self-advocate specifically about specific situations.
100%, yes. The work situation jumps to mind. Like, unfortunately, autism does still carry a lot of misunderstanding and stigma, especially in like a professional work setting. There is a legit kind of safety issue to disclosing the actual label of autism. But now that you know that, you can say, hey, I'm realizing my brain works different, and it would really help me out to wear earplugs for part of the day. Is that okay? And I really just need an extra 10 minutes at this point in the day to go take a break. Is that okay? And so like, yeah, learning, once we have the language, a lot of times what happens, there's kind of this process when somebody finds out they're autistic, there's all of a sudden all of these other realizations of, oh, that's why I'm that way. Oh, that's why I do that. And so as you realize all of those things, now you can come back and ask for those accommodations. You can use language specific to that issue instead of just saying, hey, I'm autistic. Can I wear earplugs?
It will help that person in the long run understand that not every autistic person is the same.
Yes.
Not every ADHDer is the same. And so that kind of actually helps to break down some of that stigma because it is much more specific. And then, it can be helpful not only personally, but also for the person that you're sharing it with to help them kind of understand a little bit better.
Absolutely. And you can build up to full disclosure too. So like maybe I decide I don't want to say it at work right away, but I do need to ask for an accommodation. And over time, I realize my employer is great. We're really trusting this is working well. You can always disclose later on and say, hey, so here's the situation. I'm actually autistic. Here's some other things I think we could do as a workplace as a whole that would be better for neurodivergent people. Like, just because we don't disclose in the beginning doesn't mean we can't later as part of that self-advocacy and like social advocacy. And they might, like you said, put the dots together that, oh, you're different than someone else that I know who's autistic, and doing that educational work.
You kind of alluded to this earlier, but the people who often are well-meaning friends and family, but not always, who want more information or they try to push you to get you to share more, although that could be the case in a workplace setting or in a school setting or wherever. How can people recognize and address when that's happening, when they're feeling that pressure to disclose more than what they maybe would like?
Yeah, I think you said, I mean, there's usually an internal feeling of, I'm not comfortable saying this out loud. Like, trust that at first. This speaking to my people pleasers, like, I know that feels really uncomfortable to trust that feeling, but sometimes that feeling's happening for a reason. If your body is giving you an entire sensory experience of, I don't want to go further into this conversation, like, believe that. And I'm a big fan of practicing what you want to say. And so if you're going to go tell your parents for the first time, you're going to the big family dinner and you're going to bring up for the first time that like, hey, I really need people to not hug me today. And it's going to bring on a whole conversation. Practice what you want to say. And when it comes to setting boundaries, keep it really simple. I'm having a rough day and the hugs don't feel good, though I know they're well-intentioned. So can we high five today? And leave it at that. And you don't have to over-explain why, but I think it's so helpful to figure out exactly what you want to say. And I literally drive around town having these conversations over and over and over again. So by the time the conversation happens with somebody, it feels relatively natural for me to say that boundary and stand by it.
Yeah, I think that scripting is really useful.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do that automatically, but sometimes we maybe need to do it more intentionally.
Yes.
And be really thinking about it and feel comfortable with however we're going to say it, that's just kind of, it is what it is.
Yeah.
And I guess if people perhaps push on that a little bit more, you don't have to feel obligated to give more information. It's okay. Like that statement, no is a complete sentence.
Yes.
It's okay to just stand by that, even though it's really hard sometimes too.
Yeah. And this is where, like, when we talk about boundaries, a lot of times people say, like, well, I'm going to set a boundary with my mom. If she does this, then I won't talk to her anymore. And we can't control what other people do. So when we set boundaries, the boundary is for us. I will not let someone speak to me this way. Mom can talk however she wants. She can say whatever she wants because I can't control her. I can only control my response. And so that person who's going to keep pushing and keep asking for more details, no, that's all I'm comfortable saying today.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to continue discussing this. And then obviously, given the situation, if you continue to ask me this question, I'm going to have to remove myself from the situation today and I'm going to leave.
Yeah.
And so, like, knowing what is your threshold in your response if you do have to keep saying no, because sometimes there becomes a next action that you need to take to reinforce and protect your well-being.
And I can understand how people would maybe be afraid of doing that because they're worried about the repercussions. They're worried about what happens next.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably if I was talking to one of my clients at the office about this and that was their concern, maybe the next reflection point would be something along the lines of, what do you really want that relationship to be like with that person? Because wherever you set that boundary is going to be, that's the expectation.
Yes.
And if that's somebody who's not going to respect that boundary, that definitely doesn't make them more worthy of crossing that boundary for their comfort. And hopefully people can understand that or at least accept it, even if they don't understand it.
And I think that's a great way to frame it, like, for the person who's pushing the boundary, like, I know you don't understand why I'm asking you this today. Will you please just respect it?
Mm.
And sometimes that's what they need to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know there's a strong urge to want people to understand what we're asking. Definitely a thing I struggle with. I want it to make sense for them so they can see it from my side. But sometimes it's never going to make sense.
Right.
And sometimes you just have to say, I understand that you don't understand. That's okay. Can you at least just support me in this?
I want to ask you about the reverse, which I see a lot of times with my younger clients who I work with, where they're the ones who aren't picking up on the boundary from somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share a little bit about either how people might be able to reflect on that for themselves or how they might be able to support kids or teens or even adults in their lives who maybe want to understand that but don't pick up on it as automatically, and so then they become the person who's pushing too much or not understanding?
Yeah. Receiving boundaries is kind of its own skill set too.
Yeah.
I think for the person who might keep pushing is when you've asked the same question 5 times, even if you've worded it differently each time and you're still not getting an answer, is tuning into that. And I kind of don't know what the tip is other than, like, reflecting back on that. If the conversation is circular, at some point somebody's got to break the circle. If you realize it's circular, it might be your turn to break that circle. It might be a reflection that happens later of, like, well, why did they get so frustrated with me? Why did they hang up on me? Oh, I kept asking about this and they weren't answering it. Maybe they weren't ready to answer.
I can think of another type of example that happens, and I think with adults and with kids, but when we talk about those physical boundaries, there are some people who are just touchers.
Yes.
They're huggers, they're in people's space or whatever. And I think that's a really hard one. It's not always as verbal.
Yeah.
Sometimes what ends up happening is then somebody reacts to that,
Yeah.
usually sometimes in an aggressive or a defensive way, one or the other. And it's like a surprise. It's like, but in all of these situations, the more explicit we can communicate about things, the better.
Yeah.
So even that person who's feeling like their physical boundaries are being infringed upon, to verbally say, hey, I don't feel comfortable with that, or hey, I need a little bit more space, or I don't really like it when you come up behind me and put your hand on my back when I'm not expecting it. Like, being able to verbalize those things is better both for them, but also for the other person. Not that it's that person's job to teach anyone, but when we find ourselves frustrated by things, if we don't communicate them, when we expect people to just understand, we're not helping ourselves or helping them.
Agreed. Yeah, I have rarely gotten in trouble by over communicating in my life. I've gotten in trouble by oversharing. I'm gonna clarify the difference here. But by saying the words, even if I have gotten up and walked away and like physically shown that I don't want to be touched, sometimes that's not enough. God love my husband. He used to think it was adorable to tickle me. And I laugh because it's the natural response to tickling, but I loathe being tickled. Mm-hmm. And that would be what would happen is it would turn into me accidentally like punching him or me finally bursting into tears because it was too much. And like, I finally had to learn to say the words, I know I'm laughing, but you have to understand I do not like this situation.
Right.
And we had to have the conversation a couple of times in the moment and outside of the moment. And I think that's the other thing too, is like in this communicated enough, sometimes these communications have to happen ahead of time. Sometimes they have to happen afterwards. I think of like family members, kids who don't like being hugged, especially by someone they're seeing once a year, someone who's essentially a stranger. This is where you can really advocate for them. Check in with them before the hand. Like, hey, we're going to go see auntie and uncles. Are you okay with hugs today? No? Are you okay with high fives today? Awesome. Today's a high five day. And then lead that conversation with the other adults. Hey,
yeah,
Jeremy doesn't like hugs, but he's really great at high fives. Can you help him show you how like good you are at high fives? And so sometimes these conversations like before the event, protect the other person with the boundary if you can, and then check in with them afterwards. Like, hey, did that feel better? Did that make it easier for you?
One of the other major risks about not setting appropriate boundaries is just burnout.
Yeah.
How can people identify if they're getting to the point of burnout? And are there any ideas to help them kind of recover?
I talk a lot about journaling, but in the sense that there's no right way to journal. Do what feels good to you. But I think whether it's daily or weekly, I think we need to check in with ourselves. And especially a lot of neurodivergent folks, we don't always have the best interoception. We don't always have a great sense of how we're feeling, especially in the moment, is taking some time at the end of the day and go, look at the whole day and go, oh, I had a headache all day, but I drank a ton of water. So it's not that. What else was going on? And seeing where your energy is at, doing a little evaluation. How do you feel? Do you feel dirty, sticky, icky? It can show up a lot of different ways on our body. And then when we're feeling that, then like, okay, that's your first indicator that you're on the wrong track. And so then going back, okay, was there a lot of social interaction today? Was there a lot of Zoom calls? Because those tap my brain like nothing else. Like, was there that person that's always pushing my boundaries? Okay, we figured out what the problem is. Now, where can I go back and maybe create a little bigger boundary? So that's a really great point I don't think we've touched on yet, is boundaries also shift. So today I might have the mental capacity for you to call me crying and for us to sit on the phone for an hour and work through your breakup. Tomorrow I might not. And so knowing that like, just because I said, I'm not going to talk about this anymore today, doesn't mean that maybe tomorrow I can't. Or if you're feeling that burnout, that those buffers might need to be a little bit bigger for a while.
It's okay for me to shift my expectation. I have that right to make those changes. And sometimes, again, going back to that people-pleasing thing, people feel like they can't do that. They feel like I was there for them in the past, so now I always have to. Or I did this thing for them, the other day, and so now I always have to do it. But there's not that same precedent. Like you're allowed to shift that and communicate that and not get upset with yourself or pressure yourself even to do that.
Yeah, our capacities as humans are always changing. When you're interacting with someone, you don't know how their home life is or how their work life is. Like if everything at home and work is easy, I have a much bigger capacity for everybody else's nonsense. But slammed at work, my husband's traveling, I'm stressed about having to take care of the whole house by myself. I'm not going to have capacity for that. And like you said, being able to communicate that this evening, I just don't have the energy for this phone call. Can you check in with me tomorrow and see if we can have this conversation tomorrow?
Casey, I'm so glad that we had this conversation today. I think it's really important. As we wrap up, my last question to you is this. If you were talking to one of your clients and they were really struggling with setting boundaries because they feel anxious about communicating with those around them and about those boundaries, what specifically would you say to them?
You are always first in your life. Your physical and mental and emotional well-being is always number one. And so whatever you need to do to protect that, you have permission to do.
Casey, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
The process of developing an awareness of where our boundaries are and how we can set effective boundaries is one that changes and grows as we become more aware of our emotions and relationships. We realize that we didn't heed that nagging feeling of discomfort after we shared more than we were comfortable with in a conversation, or we find ourselves avoiding a certain person who inevitably tends to ask us questions we don't really want to answer. Neurodivergent people are constantly asked to push beyond their comfort zone in so many ways because accommodations aren't offered or available. And that can lead us to begin to question our own intuition about that feeling of discomfort or anxiety in other situations too. The more we can learn for ourselves and for our kids to recognize those boundaries and find ways to honor them, the healthier our relationships and our mental health will be in the long run. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. See you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
I forgot to mention that I have a strong urge and thirst for the word. Inside daydreams, I can see past the caravans, be caught inside an oyster, shimmering, glimmering, make waves in the sky, stick my tongue.
Casey Jourdan's info, her website, email, social media, etc. are available in the show notes. Also, if you still haven't joined our Facebook group or followed us on Twitter or checked out our YouTube channel, we invite you to do those things. It's a great way for us to stay in touch with you, and we just love staying in touch. It's one of our favorite things, besides sunsets and cotton candy. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
I forgot to mention that I have a strong urge, a thirst for the word. Cold river sighs keep me alive. I stick my tongue out. I forgot to mention cold river sighs. You keep me alive, keep me alive, keep me alive.
This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.